Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast, and Merry Christmas.
Yeah, I think it's appropriate to say Merry Christmas,
Yeah.
even though we know that some people listen to this immediately, or some people could be listening to this in May of next year.
Sure.
But it's still good to say, hey, congratulations, Mary, Jesus has come.
Right.
You're John Ackerman. I'm Brian
am.
Bales. I stole your line there,
Yes,
but that's
yeah.
okay.
Yeah, all good. So we had promised in our last episode, as we were wrapping up the series on prayer, in particular on prayer for healing, and we had one episode left to do in this calendar year of 2022, and this is it.
Yeah.
We've got a 4-week series that we're doing called How to Have a Wonderful Life, which seems apropos for this time of year, partially because the holidays don't always feel wonderful, and this might be helpful. Also, if you've ever seen the old movie, if you caught last week's message from Mike Haynes, there's some questions about how old this movie is.
Yes.
But there's something about this time of year that we find ourselves able to receive an extra dose of hope and encouragement, but also often in need of an extra dose of hope and encouragement.
That's right.
And we're spending 4 weeks on this on Sundays. We're going to do one episode on the podcast. So
We're going to have to hurry, probably.
buckle your seatbelts.
Yeah, exactly. Because, this podcast is created around this idea of what it takes, what it means to take what you might hear on Sunday in person or online and to take that faith forward into Monday through Saturday. And so typically we dig a little deeper than we're going to today. So if we don't go far enough for you in something, that's great. We would love to still have a conversation with you. You can always email us at faithforward@cfcwired.org, and one of us will get back to you because we'd love to have a more connected conversation with you on this. But the title of this obviously is a riff off It's a Wonderful Life, star Jimmy Stewart, star of that, George Bailey. It's a classic. It shows all the time on TBS during the Christmas season. We have a copy. You can find it many times on whatever you stream from. But the title of this is How to Have a Wonderful Life. And the reason why is I don't want us to break this series down. It's as simple as just steps. But often what happens in life is we have an idea about something, but not an idea about how to go about it. And so for those of us who have ever listened to this show or this podcast, for those who have been in church, you've most likely heard this idea that Jesus said himself in John chapter 10, verse 10, that I came that you could have life and life to the full. And actually one of the paraphrases of this verse in John chapter 10, verse 10, if you look at a paraphrased version of scriptures, I've come that you could have life, but the wonderful life, life to the full of wonder. And so it just strikes us that many times we're well-intentioned, but we don't necessarily know the how-to. You were just talking to me off podcast that you had some people install Windows, and you know how to do it, but these were the professionals.
Yep.
And so you looked and you watched and you gained some how-to knowledge at a greater level. All right. So you might have some basic ideas. That's great. Hopefully we're bringing you some ideas from Scripture that take it to the next level, because the first thing we said in week 1 is you have to search for the right thing at the right place.
Yep.
So if you try to search for the wonderful life anywhere other than Jesus, it's going to fail. Right? And it could last for a good while, but ultimately financial resources or family relationships or the feeling that you get from your job or whatever it might be, those don't last. Only Jesus did. So sort of the first step that we talked in week 1 is make sure you're going to the right place to find that right thing. And that right place is Jesus to have that wonderful life. But then we talked about in week 2, and actually that's when Mike, our director of youth ministries, I can't speak well today, and you know what I'm checking right there. We love you, Mike, as you're listening. He was talking about this idea of purpose. And if we don't understand our identity first, then we're not going to have the proper purpose. So if you go to Jesus, and I try to find life from him, the second thing is, how are we supposed to live? And we went to this particular section of Scripture from 1 Peter that talks about Jesus is our cornerstone. And Mike made it very clear that this verse is saying not that Jesus is the cornerstone of our circumstances, but he's the cornerstone of our life. Yeah. And too often we try to get purpose from circumstances. We try to get purpose from these things. And so he just talked about this idea that our purpose in life is to receive and experience and show others the goodness of God. That was sort of week 2. So go to the right place, Jesus. He then gives us our purpose. Yep. Then we start at week 3. And that's this sort of tension that while we may understand that Jesus is not the cornerstone of our circumstances have great influence in our life.
Absolutely.
And in those moments when our circumstances don't line up with our preconceived beliefs about how God's supposed to do something, how it's supposed to work, there's this big 5-letter word that we need to grasp, and that is this idea of trust. How do we trust God in the midst of what he's providing, this wonderful life, when the wonderful life doesn't exactly look the way we think it should, or circumstances might tempt us to believe something different. And in a lot of times happen, and we'll talk about the enemy as he showed up, as we talked in the first talk, week 1, Genesis chapter 3. It says, look at your circumstances. This is a lot what happens now in our life. And so that was the third part, learning to do our part and what God does his part, and then trust in that moment. And then in the last week of the series, we talked about this idea from Galatians chapter 6, that we're to be helpers. We're supposed to allow other people to help us, and we'll get into that, and we're supposed to help others, and that we will begin to experience that life and life to the full when we build that. So that's the quick 4 steps to the how-to. In no way, shape, or form do we believe this is comprehensive, right? Any more than that sort of beginner's guide that we may have to how to put in a window is comprehensive, but it's a good start. It's a good place. And so that's, as we're talking about through this, that's the basic structure. That's the basic how-to. We wanted to connect because every week does build on the others. And while we always encourage you to listen to Sunday before you listen to the podcast, we realize it doesn't always happen that way. That's okay. We wanted to give you sort of the background. But we also encourage you, if you've not listened to Mike and when he talked, or if you've not listened to some of the talks I did in this series, they really do build on each other. They can stand alone, but you get more out of it when they build together. So I think that's what I would like to say is somewhat quick summary, but maybe not so much.
Right. And again, we were talking just before we hit record, there's so much that we could say on each one of these topics that hopefully would be helpful, or at least, further illustrate the point. And we don't have time for that. Or at least we're not making time for that.
No.
But when we started off with, the first week's topic of you got to find the right thing in the right place. One of the things that I think is helpful for us, whether it's at this time of year or whatever time you're catching this, is that when it feels like we're not in the right place or we're not finding the right thing, what do we do? And we can take some cues from the movie that we're referencing during this series, that at some point you have to be honest about where you're finding yourself. At some point there has to be a little bit of not a condemning conversation, not a self-critical conversation, but a curious conversation of how did I get here? And in an ideal world, to invite God into that conversation.
That's right.
Not as a disinterested party and not as a scolding party, but as the one who probably sees your life better than you do and can help answer that question better. But you get to be part of that conversation. And so one of the things that you touched on in the first week is that if we're going to find the right thing in the right place, we also have to recognize that there's somebody who's actively opposed to us finding the right thing in the right place. And that's part of the story that we need to consider. And that's part of what has to belong in that question of how did I get here? Is it wasn't just you. It wasn't just you. There is a thief who comes to steal, kill, and destroy.
That's right.
And taking that into account in the narrative of your life, you don't find yourself where you are today just because of what happened yesterday or in the last week or in the last month. It's the totality of your story that brought you to today. We saw that in the movie with George Bailey, right? That there's so much good and there's so many good moments, but he reaches a point of absolute crushing despair. And it's surprising him that that's where he is, right? He almost doesn't understand, how did I get here? Yeah. And it was a moment that seemed to tip the scales, but it was also a life story that needed some contextualization.
And I think that maybe, as if you're familiar with the movie, you know that he spent his whole life basically serving other people. Yeah. He spent his whole life not doing what he wanted to do, but doing what he felt like he was supposed to do. And in his heart and in his mind, he came to this point where he felt like none of that made a difference. Yeah. In fact, it was a financial crisis, and he believed that he was actually better off dead than he was alive and making a difference. And what I'd like to say that I certainly hope that none of us ever have to come to that place. That moments like this, when we're talking on Sunday or we're talking right here via the podcast, that we can think about this idea of like, well, how do I not get to that place? How do I take my faith forward? And I think one of the ways that we can begin to sort of do some preventative maintenance on our spiritual walk with God is to begin to look in through a very practical lens about where I'm putting my hope. And one of the ways for me, John, that this works, and I'm very zeros and ones, sometimes to my detriment and sometimes to my benefit. But it's been a help for me when I'm doing like a checkup spiritually, because I'm not where George Bailey is, right? Or was in the movie. But it doesn't mean I can't be on the road of the path. Because a lot of the things that he were doing, again, very good things, but missing a few things. And so as I was thinking about what we're going to talk about, one of the things that I attempt to do is begin to maybe go back, and whether it's actually physically with a piece of paper and a pen or on a computer or just kind of rolling through my mind is, track where I'm focusing on, track where my time is put. Do I find myself spending an inordinate amount of time right now focusing on the stock market? If you're listening to this in December of 2022, it's gone up and down. And hopefully, if you're fortunate enough to have a retirement account, you've not been looking at it too much about how it goes up and down. Some of you be like, I wish I was that fortunate. So pick something else. Right. But I know this, that if I spend a whole bunch of time every day just going to this, there's a little switch that's happened in me. Like I'm putting more of my hope for the wonderful life around what winds up being this point, or when I could retire. I had a friend of mine that I told you about who was a great, godly, wonderful human being, just a wonderfully gracious human being, but that actually kept a countdown clock on their desk of when they could retire. And in their mind, when they could retire, then they could go do God's work. That's well-intentioned, but it's off. It's thinking, I can't have the wonderful life until here. And Jesus didn't write, I came to have life and life to the full someday. Yeah. Like when you get rid of this job or when this financial situation. And so taking a look at those things around us, where we spend the vast amount of our time with our mental energy, or the vast amount of our time with our emotional energy, or our actual physical energy, and look at that and maybe just taking the time to chart it out. And some people are like, I don't have time to do that. Well, let's start there. Right. And then just be honest. Just be honest about what that reflects. Or if you struggle with being honest with yourself, and you have someone in your life that'll be honest with you, slide them that piece of paper, slide them an email, say, tell me what you see. I was just thinking through this first one, maybe just a real practical way for someone who's like, well, I don't feel like I'm at George Bailey. Great, awesome. Let's not get there. Yep.
Yeah, and another thing that I think I found really helpful here, and again, it can feel difficult sometimes to strike the right balance. It feels like I'm skewing too far one way or the other. For some people, when things aren't going well, and when it feels like things haven't gone well for a while, it's like, well, we're just not going to talk about it. Onward and upward. Yeah. Right? And there's a degree to which that's helpful, right? Because you're not allowing your circumstances to dictate reality. But there's also a version of that that's suppression, right? Not looking down here. I'm not thinking about anything down here. We're going to wall that off. We're going to brick it up. And that's somebody else's problem. It's not somebody else's problem. It's your problem. You can then go too far the other way of, I'm going to express every single time I'm disappointed. I'm going to express every single time things don't go my way. I'm going to express every single time I feel like God hung me out to dry. And there's a level of that is actually very, very necessary to verbalize the reality of your heart. And you can take that too far and begin to believe that that is your reality, that God has hung you out to dry, that he's not actually good, that he's not actually kind, that he's not actually taking care of you, right? But if we get rid of the extremes and we come into the middle, it's important to exist in a place where you can be honest both with yourself and with God about how you feel, and to recognize that those feelings may not actually be true in reality, but they feel true. Yeah. And that matters, because your internal reality will help to shape your understanding of reality one way or the other. You mentioned what you're saying there, and there's so much that I know that you and I resonate very similar like on situations like this, and it made me think about what Mike talked about really in that second week. I think you even have a quote here, but the thing is, this is what Mike said, if you haven't heard it, Jesus isn't the cornerstone of your circumstances, Jesus is the cornerstone of you. The reason your external reality doesn't match up with being chosen, royal, and holy is because those traits describe your internal reality in Christ, not your external. Chosen by God is about who you are on the inside. Royal priesthood is about who you are on the inside. Holy nation is about who you are on the inside. And I'd read his notes before we went there, but I have to tell you, when I heard him speak it just sat differently. It sat at a level that it hadn't sat at yet. And you're expressing this tension to where you can fall on either an extreme. I know the extreme that I fall onto. I fall on the extreme
where I'm going to live in denial.
Sure.
While circumstances don't dictate my reality, the circumstances I live in are real.
Yeah.
That's the difference. And if I start to ignore and act like things aren't real, then I can't go to God for what he wants to tell me in those moments, to what he wants to change about me. And so I always have this visual, for those of you to bring in another movie, of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And there's this famous scene where a guy's trying to cross the bridge, and there's a black knight, and he's guarding the bridge, and it's a ridiculously satirical scene, especially in English comedy, where his arm gets cut off, right? And he acts like it's not that big of a deal. He goes, "It's but a flesh wound." There is nothing spiritual about living like the Black Knight. Right? You are not weak if you recognize the fact that your circumstances are difficult. You're not. That's the extreme that we want to go on the other side. At the same time, we have a spiritual difficulty or problem if just because we perceive in those circumstances, that begins to dictate the character of God, the reality of God. And that's really where I think Mike just drove that home, is when we start thinking that Jesus is the cornerstone of our circumstances, and we think through what it means that he's our cornerstone and our purpose is something external before it's something internal, then there's this challenging sort of scenario. And I am just a person that would much rather deny it. It's it's not real. But internally, it doesn't change anything. And then if you've ever, here's a litmus test. If you ever find yourself seemingly being okay, and then this small little thing happens that in a vacuum would have never bothered you, and then you just kind of go boom. I call it the hand grenade. Hand grenades are compressed energy, and then you pull a pin, and from this very small thing, this massive thing occurs. If you've ever had that happen to you, or you've seen that, there's a good chance what's been occurring is that you've gone too far to the other end, and you've been denying the fact that your circumstances are real. And then just only so much any of us can take. We were never designed to suppress it. We were designed to take our circumstances. We were designed to take our difficulties back to Jesus and allow him to interpret them for us. And so it's just some things as I was processing what you were saying. I was like, oh yeah, I can do that. I can do that. And definitely when Mike said this on Sunday, I was like, oh, I read that. I knew this where he was going with this. It's totally biblical, totally true. And I totally did not get it at the time at the level that I got it when I heard it. So.
And again, there's so much in it that either our life has taught us that this is the right way, or people have modeled for us, this is the way you do it. Here's another good litmus test. Are you bottling all this up and it's just going to explode at some point? How often do you find yourself using the phrase, well, at least it's not? Or at least I'm not? Or what? Which again, there's a degree of that's healthy recognition and gratitude that there are situations that objectively or subjectively could be far worse. But if that results in the constant diminishment and stuffing of your circumstances, to not give yourself the ability or the bandwidth to process those things because it's not cancer, or it's not actual literal starvation, or it's not dismemberment, one appendage at a time, like the Black Knight and Monty Python, right? Well, if it was that, I would give myself time and space to process that and bring those things and bring your worries and cares and concerns to God. But since it's not that, this, 'tis but a flesh wound. Just stop it. Just stop it.
Well, when you think about it, maybe through this lens, there are over 8 billion people in this world, which means that if you just do math, right, there's only possibly one person on the planet that doesn't have something worse than them. That has to just work that way. And so that means for the rest of the 7,990,000, whatever the number is, right? There's some level of denial of not dealing with what you have. And while there is, I think, a very appropriate place for gratitude, even in the midst of circumstances that are less than optimal, what happens is when we do that approach to it, we're often cutting off the lifeline or the communication way that God wants to talk to us about those circumstances. Because it's what we say all the time, over and over. God is much more focused on our internal. Not that our external doesn't matter, but our internal before our external. And so, maybe for the first time in this podcast this time around, if you're not sure you struggle with that, here's the thing, ask God. He'll tell you. I
mean, it's 1 Peter 5:8. Bring all your worries and cares to God.
Yep.
Because he cares about you. Right? That's the invitation. It's not unless you're in the bottom 1 percentile of the human population that's truly suffering. Then bring your worries and cares to God.
Yeah.
Otherwise, everybody else, don't bother him. Right? All of you, all 8 billion, bring your worries and cares to God because he cares about it. It's a place he wants to dialogue. He's not expecting you to just get past it, get over it, move on so you can get back to work. Right? That's a place he wants to engage, even as he will help you continue to navigate in the midst of the circumstances, in the midst of the pain. Right? But he wants to talk to you about those painful things. And you can either do it as they come up, or you can go the hand grenade option.
Yeah. You know, I think over and over as we continue to build through this, all right, first, go to the right place.
Yeah.
Then begin to understand our purpose. I took the third talk in here, and as I was, for lack of better terms, crafting these talks, this one was the hardest one for me. And I think it's because it comes from, Proverbs 16, verse 9, talks about this idea that the heart of our man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. It's this idea of letting God do his part and us do our part. And I unfortunately tend to be a person sometimes of extremes. And since I'm a person of extremes, this particular one is much more difficult for me.
Yeah.
And so I think I've shared this analogy before, but I don't know if I've ever actually explained it out too much. But if we think of some sort of floating vessel as us, there are 3 different types in this analogy. There's the rowboat, the raft, or the sailboat. And so I tend to be a person who naturally falls to the rowboat, so that I'm the person in the boat, my life, right? And I'm rowing. I'm all the power. I need to make it happen. I need to think better. I need to strategize better. I need to put effort better. But it's funny when you write something and then you try to reflect it back to yourself, but this is kind of what I said, and it's true. Like, the planning of our life by the means of reasons or the power of our mind will never lead to the full and wonderful life that Jesus has wanted for us, right? And so, so rowboat doesn't work. But that doesn't mean that we go to the other extreme, like the raft. The raft is you just kind of lay there and whatever happens to you. So it's not this call to say, all right, don't do any planning. It's like, plan your whole life yourself. No, that's wrong. Well, don't do any planning. It's not that either, but rather there's this interesting interconnection in our lives where the God of the universe, and one of the reasons why I actually kind of love this analogy is because it involves wind, and anyone who studies scripture know the Holy Spirit and wind is a lot connected.
Yeah.
But if you think about a sailboat, like if the wind comes and the sails aren't up, nothing happens. And the wind, by the way, doesn't put the sails up. You do.
Right.
But at the same time, you can put all the sails up in the world, and anyone who's ever been out on a sailboat in a lake and the wind just stopped, you're not going anywhere. Yeah. Maybe a current will take you if you're out in the ocean on a catamaran. You're not going anywhere whatsoever on a lake, and I've had that happen to me before. And I think that illustrates really that tension. It has to be sort of the both and, right? Because it also talks about, as I said in Proverbs chapter 21, no wisdom, no insight, no plan can succeed against the Lord. Row all you want, but it's not happening. But it isn't. So there's this tension of learning in our life of what it looks like to plan, but do that humbly. Like, all right, because for me, I know I use this phrase like, well, failure to plan is planning to fail. Well, what sneaks in is the reverse, that because I planned, it's all going to work out the way I think it is. Yeah. And then we get disillusioned. Oh, we don't have this life because I did this, and this. In fact, I think that's implied a little bit in George. Well, I've helped all these people. This should happen. And the result of him helping people, including his Uncle Billy, who lost $8,000, who, by the way, he bailed out several times in the movie, is that Uncle Billy is the actual person who does the thing that isn't so great that winds up where he is. And so it was implied in that. And again, we're not trying to exegete It's a Wonderful Life and make it out to be scripture. It's not. But there's a lot of things, whether intentionally Frank Capra meant to do that, the director of the movie, or not, very, very much plays out. And I think that applies to our life. So it's just not that. But there's this verse, right? Proverbs chapter 3.
Yeah. Because I think if we're being honest, we'd really love for the title of that movie and the title of our life to be How to Have a Comfortable Life.
Ooh, yeah, I think it's good.
And that's just not it. That's not the promise. It's not the invitation. It's not reality.
Well, and right, because we begin to define wonderful as comfortable. That's the other thing, because we said at the beginning of the series, let's be careful though, because the wonderful life Jesus has for us doesn't always look like the wonderful life we think it's supposed to be.
And so I'll even get on with your analogy, Pastor Bales, with I'm not supposed to be the rowboat and I'm not supposed to be the raft, but if I'm going to be the sailboat, then the way I want it to work is that when I put the sails up, I want the wind to blow.
Preach.
And when I don't have the sails up, I don't want the wind to blow. And so when I do things, I want God to bless it, is the way that I'd really love for this life to work. Right? George does all these good things. Again, not to exegete It's a Wonderful Life, but he does all these good things, and then he's surprised when there's still troubles, which welcome to the other 7 billion and change of us that feel the exact same way. And so we come to this verse in Proverbs, trust in the Lord with all your heart and don't lean on your own understanding. Okay, great. So sailboat, right? I can't make the boat move, but I can do my part. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Okay, great. So I'm acknowledging him. God, you're the wind. God, I'm putting up my sails. Blow. God, you're not blowing. God, I put up the sails. God, blow. Okay, God's not blowing. I acknowledged him. Let's start the motor. Right? I tried to acknowledge him. It didn't work.
Anyone's ever been sailing, you know that one of the questions says, do we have a trolling motor behind there? Right? Exactly.
Right. And so one of the things that I find interesting, we were talking about this before we hit record, as we so often do. Some people are like, how many hours do you all spend talking before you hit record? It's not that many. But when we get to that second part of Proverbs 3, it's verses 5 and 6. So in verse 6, it's in all your ways acknowledge him. We were talking about how that word in the Hebrew for acknowledge is the word yada. And that is not an intellectual knowing. It's not a recognition of the reality of. It's not a God's real and hopefully he makes this work. It's an experiential knowing. It's an intimate knowing. It is a deeply relational knowing. It's very similar to Psalm 46, which you'll see on wall hangings and memes all over the place. Be still and know that I am God. Right? Be still and know is not the be still and acknowledge the reality that there is a God. It's be still and be deeply, intimately, relationally connected to God. And that's the part where I think as we're trying to make this transition to how to have a wonderful life, you cannot escape this part. You cannot make your own wonderful life. You cannot rowboat your way to a wonderful life. You can't raft your way to a wonderful life. And you cannot sailboat your way to a wonderful life if you're insisting that the wind blows as you decree.
And one of the things that you might be processing and thinking right now, it's like, well, I don't ever do that. Can I encourage you to ask God if you do that? Because I think one of the traps, especially for people like me who definitely lean towards the rowing side, is there was a whole lot of my life, and still can happen on a consistent basis if I'm not vigilant, spending time with Jesus, where I just row and don't even realize I'm rowing. Right? I just row because it seems like the right thing to do. Like why should I wait here? Because not rowing feels like waiting to me. And waiting often feels wrong. Both of those, by the way, aren't true. Not rowing doesn't mean waiting, and waiting is not wrong. It's just I'm talking about the things that I have inside of me. And especially in a culture, by the way, that builds into this wrong thought that our value comes from what we produce, productivity. It's really easy to look at not rowing in a moment as lazy, so I don't have value. I think if you're in a moment and, as you mentioned, like I expect when the sails to go up, the wind to happen, and you put the sails up and the wind isn't happening, you are that person like me. Like it's like, all right, where's the motor that I got? The little small one, maybe you got a big one, I don't know. But that says in that moment that when the wind doesn't do what I want it to do, I have a motor to do it on my own. And the truth is, our spiritual life shouldn't come with a motor. It shouldn't. It should be in that way. You know, you can't do it on your own. I said this on the Sunday when I talked about this, that control is an illusion. It is an illusion that eventually that pops. And let me hear this. I'm not even saying it's going to pop this side of eternity. I've not met someone that it hasn't. But even if it doesn't, there's going to be this time where 1 Corinthians talks about, especially a believer, well, now we're going to see clearly, face to face. It's 1 Corinthians 13, and that section of Scripture was not designed for weddings, even though we use it a lot. I'm just pontificating, right? But where we're going to see clearly. Yeah. And there are going to be moments where even when we thought, oh, we had control, I did this and this happened. That's not control. One of the things to talk about is God often honors our plans, but that doesn't mean we were controlling with our plans. Yeah. That's part of this idea of sovereignty, that he has both the power and the right to do what he chooses. And there are this understanding, I think, sometimes that, I need to be in control, and I've been in control, and this has all worked well. Listen, if it has worked well, it's not because you've actually been in control. It's because God honored what you did. But just check with God on that in those moments. And I know that is something I need to do. And so it's like, where are we, God, in this planning process? What's my part? What's your part? Yeah.
So as we get to this last part, quick recap. Step 1 of this, how to have a wonderful life. Just be honest about where your heart is, right? Yep. You can only get the right thing from the right place. And so if it feels like you haven't found the right thing yet, take an honest assessment, not alone, but invite God into it. How did we get here? How did we get here? And maybe what does the path out look like? And so that second part is the recognition that the path out often begins internally before it happens externally. That there has to be, on some level, a deeper realization of who you are and who God is, and not just getting the circumstances right so we can keep on going as usual. And that means letting God do his part while we do our part. It's a both and. It's not either or. It's not the rowboat and it's not the raft, but it's the integrated sailboat, right? Where the wind and the sails are cooperating and collaborating. Because when that happens, there's some really beautiful things that occur. And they occur both around us, but they also occur within us. Yeah. And so you talked a little bit in this 4th week about one of the things that happens as part of this wonderful life is we get to help make other people's lives wonderful.
We're designed to be helpers of other people. We're designed as well to be helped. And part of the reason that so goes back to sort of that second week when Mike was talking, that when we help others, we actually we show others the goodness of God. Because if you think about it, outside of Jesus, what Jesus done for us, it would make sense. Survival of the fittest, man. It's about me.
Yep.
But Jesus gives us different purpose, and it's mirrored in that way. And that's, again, if you've never watched the movie, I'm not going to shame you for not watching the movie, but I really think you should watch it. It's a great movie, and for those of you who've not seen anything ever in black and white before, trust me, it's still worth it. But, not giving away the movie, you're like, well, you're telling me about it. But there's this end scene where he's in trouble, and here's George, who spent much of his life helping and doing good things. Now he's in this place, right, where someone else is helping him in his burden, helping him. And so one of the aspects that I hope you certainly grab from our time here, and hopefully grab it on Sunday, is when we think about this idea of helping, there's a tendency to think of it through, I'm supposed to help others, but not necessarily through this lens that we are supposed to be helped from time to time. See, George was a helper his whole life, and at the end of the movie, he had to be helped. He couldn't. He had no control. He couldn't get out of it. And scripturally, this is one of the things that we accidentally do a lot, especially as Americans, Westerners, is we forget books like Galatians. They're written to a community, a church. Yeah. We read it as this is written to us individually. And by the way, as part of a church, it is written to us, but we're not the primary audience. So when it says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, which is love others if I've loved you, he's writing that to a whole group of people, which means that some of us from time to time are going to be the helpers. And some of us are going to have to be helped. And so when we read it as an individual, we can only think of it as this idea that, oh, I'm supposed to bear another person's burdens, right? That's what I'm supposed to do. And we'll miss this fact that part of being helped is part of, again, understanding what it means to receive, what it understands to look more like Jesus. And so for me, I mentioned this a couple weeks ago. I deeply struggle with this one. It's so much easier for me to sign up to be the helper than to be the helped. Yeah. And it goes back to those roots of I get this idea wrongly that my value comes from what I'm doing. And so if I'm not doing something, or I'm going to use this term in air quotes, if you're listening on just listening and not watching, you won't see the air quotes. If I'm not doing anything of value, right, How can I be worth this?
Yeah.
You know, as I was laying there on my back for 8 days, again, I consistently, took some time to get to the point with me, but as I'd watch my wife and she was doing all these things because she loved me, I felt like I was a burden. I felt like I was just such not worthy of it. And here's the kicker. If you'd have asked me to do that for my wife, no problem.
Yep.
I'd had no problem doing it because I love her. But asked me to receive it, oh, that's a different story. And so I think it also talks about this idea of taking an honest assessment in our life. Some of us struggle with being the helpers. Some of us struggle with being the helped. But if we're to have this wonderful life, when we look at this idea of bearing each other's burdens, we've got to be okay with both of them.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And we could probably belabor this point in a number of ways, but it really is to take stock of, and maybe this is a really good place, not only to ask God, but to ask others how they see you. Are you one that receives help well?
Yeah.
Or are you one, when people offer help, you're consistently going, no, I got it. I'm good.
Yeah.
Thanks. I appreciate it. But, and it can come from a good place, not wanting to trouble people, not wanting to inconvenience people, because there's so many more people that need help. I don't want to take up their turn. I don't want to take, right.
Yeah. And when I said on the Sunday, I mean, don't get me wrong here. When we read this word burdens, it's not talking about a backpack we should be able to carry ourselves.
Yeah.
This is talking about something that no one's designed to carry ourselves. And there are those moments that happen in our life that we cannot carry ourselves. But more importantly, we cannot, because if we think we cannot, sometimes we think it's because I'm weak or I didn't do this. Yeah. But we're not designed. We weren't made. Yeah. It's not possible to do that. And so, you know, if that's where you struggle, wow, that's for me, that's one of those places that I struggle. You know, think about that. But also, I can struggle this way too, Jon. And I don't know if you can, if you're listening, but there are times when I look through the lens of helping people, through the lens of, do they deserve my help? Did they should they have known better? Should they have that? Right? And we're not talking about a scenario where someone's consistently doing something that they know better, where they're consistently, I mean, let's go back to not exegeting It's a Wonderful Life. If you watch the movie, everybody knows that his Uncle Billy, he's not really on top of things. Right. He's very flighty. He's very that sort of stuff. You know, and if you think of that to yourself and say, well, George, I'm not going to bail you out because you should have known better than to give the money to Uncle Billy. Everything through your life says Uncle Billy is a good guy, but he can't be trusted with the books. Yeah. You brought this on yourself, so I'm not going to bail you out. You know, we all have those people in our life, right, who need help. And if our first thought is, I'm not going to do this because of blank, I think we need to go back and ask God. Because this bear one of those burdens to so fulfill the law of Christ isn't based upon whether or not someone earned the right for that burden to be bared. Because the law of Christ is to love others like Jesus has loved us. And there's nothing we have done to earn the way that Jesus has loved us. Yeah. It doesn't mean that he's always going to say bear that burden. But if that's our first thought, well, they got themselves into it, because that's really what we think about ourselves. Well, I got myself into it, so I have to get myself out of it. That's not what this is about. No. So just another litmus test as we're thinking and taking our faith forward. Yep,
absolutely. Because at core, what makes a wonderful life wonderful is not independence. No. It's not self-sufficiency. It's not isolation. Part of what makes a wonderful life wonderful is that it's shared with others.
Yeah, and Jesus himself modeled that too, right? I mean, he is God in the flesh. If you think about it, anyone who would have come to this earth and said, no, I got it, it could have been Jesus. But when we understand what Jesus did from his humanity, this earth was to model for us a way of living. You made a lot of notes here, 4, maybe not a lot, but I loved them. I loved them. We walk those through that. Because some people will be like, what are you talking about? He was Jesus.
Yeah. And I remember hearing that often over the years of, you know, we're supposed to be like Jesus, and Jesus just gave. Yeah. Right? Jesus, he served to the last. Yeah. Right? Sacrificed everything for, but I hadn't really thought about this till I was putting these notes together. You know, one of the beautiful things of Jesus coming as a baby is the years of dependence. The Son of God had to have his diaper changed daily, multiple times a day. I hear. Yeah. You know, that's the level of neediness, which some people, that word makes them cringe, but Jesus's level of neediness.
Willingly submitting himself to neediness, right? Yeah. Yeah, he's like, I'm going to model this for you.
Yeah, for years. for years as a child. Okay, well, fine. All children are like that. Okay, well, but we're talking about adults now. We're talking about adults, right? So look at Jesus with his ministry. The first thing he does is find not just followers, but friends, co-laborers, right? He refuses to save the world by himself, refuses to. And again, they're not just followers as in hangers on or people that like and retweet what he says, right? They're the people that do what he does, that he empowers in many cases to go in his stead and accomplish what he could have done on his own and go and do it. And then even on the cross, he wasn't alone. There were 2 others that were crucified with him, at least that we know of. And the one seems to want to have nothing to do with him, even in those final moments. But with the other, there's an exchange, there's an interaction. And as any of you know who have tried to serve others while your own heart is broken or while you're in physical pain, that there is something incredibly comforting about people that respond to you, even as you're trying to take care of them. And I have to imagine that there was an incredible degree of comfort that Jesus was receiving in the midst of the most excruciating thing that he'd ever endured in his life, simply because it was a shared experience.
Yeah.
And obviously that other man on the cross was not having the exact same experience that Jesus was, but there was a whole lot of shared experience there. And so even in that, Jesus didn't do it alone. And it was also making me think, and this is a story that if you've been through our Square One class, I've shared it just about every time as we talk through the week on serving.
Yeah.
That you look at the 14th chapter of Matthew, and it begins with John the Baptist being executed, Jesus' cousin. And it says after the first dozen or so verses that Jesus needed to grieve, and he tried to go off by himself, but the crowds followed. They heard where he was going, and they went after him to get from him what they felt like they needed. And it says in Matthew that Jesus had compassion for them. And so on his way to grieve, he stopped. And he ministered to them, he healed them, spoke with them, connected with them. And then the story happens that you probably learned in Sunday school, if that was part of your life, which was the feeding of 5,000 men and their families, 20,000 some odd people, in the midst of his grief, in the midst of loss and heartache. And how did we get here? How did this happen? And then it says at the end of that he sent his disciples away, told them to go back across the lake, sent all the people away. And then he went up on the mountain to be alone with God, and night fell while he was there. He spent hours receiving from his Father. He spent hours having his heart, his soul ministered to. And out of the fullness of that, he comes down the mountain and catches up with the disciples by walking on water. And it so blows away his disciples that Peter has this Sunday school moment of, Jesus, if that's you, tell me to come to you. And Peter gets to experience this thing. And it's this great moment in the midst of 2 Sunday school parables of what it looks like to serve, even when things aren't going well, but also what it looks like to make sure that you receive, that this is done in community.
Yeah. And so, our hope as we've been sort of walking through this, again, we've not dug super deep, is that each one of these steps in this journey, that maybe you've had this moment where it's, God's speaking to me here, God's speaking to me here. And if you feel that, again, go to God, ask him, is this true?
Yeah.
Even if you don't feel that, it's still good to go through this and go, hey, God, how am I doing with looking at the right thing, for the right thing in the right place? How am I doing with purpose? How am I doing with trusting you? How am I doing with being a helper and being helped? I mean, all of these. And I can promise you this. I don't just think this. I just don't feel this. I can promise you this because it comes from Scripture, that the end result will look a whole lot different than maybe you thought or I thought or anyone else thought about the wonderful life looks like. But it will be the wonderful life that Jesus wants for you.
Absolutely. So that's it for 2022.
Merry Christmas, by the way.
Christmas.
Happy New Year. Can we say that? It's a little early, but yeah, go ahead.
Whenever they watch it.
Sure.
Yeah. But as we often say, thank you for being a part of our journey, because this is still very much a journey for us. There is still much that God is showing us that we're getting to discover and experience Him in the process. And we're just so grateful that you've allowed us to be a part of your journey in whatever way, shape, or form. So from all of us here at CFC, Merry Christmas again, and we'll see you in 2023.